After watching the 50 Cent produced Diddy documentary about Sean Diddy Combs, a question naturally follows. Did it change how people view Suge Knight's role in the events surrounding Tupac Shakur's death? For some, the answer is a clear yes. Time has a way of reweighting the past. Things that once sounded like harmless bravado or artistic posturing start to feel heavier. Old lyrics, ad-libs, and quick throwaway lines land differently when you replay them through the lens of what happened next. What used to pass as exaggeration can start to feel like something closer to a signal, subtle, buried, and carefully placed. In the streets, people sometimes want the truth to be known without ever saying it directly. They want someone to hear it, but not everybody. Because once the dots fully connect, there's no rewinding it, and when it comes to Tupac, those closest to him still describe it as something that doesn't sit right. To them, it wasn't random, it was a setup, a plot, something deliberate. That's why these recent developments have pulled so much attention back to the case. According to claims repeated by 50 Cent and others, federal authorities were not only focused on Diddy's more recent legal problems. The suggestion being discussed is that investigators have long been aware of a darker trail, one that repeatedly circles back to the murders of Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G. For decades, both deaths have existed in a space between myth and unresolved reality, endlessly debated, retold, and theorized, yet never fully closed. But now, former insiders, investigators, and people who were present during those years are again revisiting what they say they saw, heard, or were told, bringing old whispers back into the light. Tupac and Biggie were once close, two artists rising fast, reshaping hip-hop in real time. Their deaths, just 6 months apart, didn't only end two lives, they cracked something cultural that never fully healed. For years, the lack of charges turned the story into legend. Documentaries were produced, narratives were spun, theories multiplied, and blame shifted from one name to another depending on the era. But that long stalemate appeared to shift when Keefe D Davis was indicted in 2023 in connection with Tupac's killing. Former lap detective Greg Kading framed it bluntly, suggesting that Keefe D and Diddy were, in effect, among the last central figures still alive in a story that has outlasted almost everyone around it. According to recorded statements that have been discussed publicly, Keefe D claimed that roughly a year before Tupac's death, Diddy allegedly spoke openly in front of members of the Crips, expressing a desire for both Tupac and Suge Knight to be killed. Keefe D further alleged that this desire was later tied to an offer, described as $1 million for it to happen. These allegations, repeated across interviews and documentary discussions, form the backbone of the renewed attention on the case, because they don't merely point to street violence, they suggest intent, planning, and money, the combination that turns rumor into something investigators can't ignore. One of the most repeated allegations centers on a series of conversations said to have happened more than once, with one of the key moments placed at Greenblatt's Deli on Sunset Boulevard. In this version of events, the atmosphere is already volatile before anyone even speaks. Tensions have been building for months, fueled by public insults, industry pressure, street politics, and the kind of ego-driven rivalry that can turn personal beef into real-world danger. The account suggests that by the time that meeting allegedly occurred, Diddy wasn't just annoyed or angry, he was scared. Not in a dramatic, emotional way, but in the cold, survival-minded way that makes people look for solutions instead of sympathy. The alleged fear wasn't simply about reputation. It was about safety, control, and the sense that the situation had escaped anyone's ability to contain it. According to this telling, Diddy allegedly framed the conflict as something that needed to be handled, as if it had become an operational problem rather than a personal one. The key point in the allegation is not just what was said, but how it was said, like it wasn't hypothetical, like it wasn't a rant, like it wasn't just talk. Keefe D is described as responding in a way that made it sound routine, almost casual, implying that this wasn't shocking language in that environment, but the kind of thing that could be understood as a direct request. The alleged agreement is often described using vague phrases, whatever it takes, which matters because vagueness gives people room to deny intent later. But Keefe D later claimed that behind that vagueness was a specific figure, $1 million. He has also claimed that both Suge Knight and Tupac Shakur were named, and that Tupac's own actions, his escalating public threats, his anger, his lyrics, his interviews were used as justification, as if he had put himself on the list. That framing is important because it recasts Tupac not as a random victim of chaos, but as a target in a plan, at least according to the allegation. Then the story branches into another layer, involving Eric Von Zip Martin, a name that carries weight in certain accounts. He's described by some as a powerful figure with proximity to Diddy, the kind of person who could move in spaces where street networks and industry networks overlap. The claim being repeated is that a weapon allegedly used in the attack may have been connected to Von Zip, either through direct possession, transfer, or proximity to the people involved. This is where the allegations become even more explosive, because it suggests the difference between street violence and coordinated facilitation. Tupac's brother and others close to the situation have argued that if Von Zip truly had any connection to the weapon or the people who moved it, then that link should have been investigated aggressively, because it would potentially bridge the gap between rumor and logistical reality. When Tupac's family is confronted with these claims, especially the rumor that money moved through intermediaries, the reaction is not polished or cautious, it is raw, because for them this isn't just theory, it's grief that never fully settled. They are often careful to acknowledge a key limitation. They don't claim to know every detail as proven fact, but emotionally their reaction still carries the same core belief that what happened to Tupac wasn't random and that too many coincidences point in the same direction. Their language reflects that. The sense of betrayal, the sense of being blindsided, and the feeling that people who should have been questioned more deeply were allowed to remain in the shadows. Another critical element in this broader narrative comes from the journals of Kirk Burroughs, a co-founder of Bad Boy Entertainment. According to the documentary, Burroughs documented a request that immediately raises questions because of how unusual it sounds. Just days before Tupac was killed, Burroughs wrote that Diddy instructed him to rent cars and drive from New York to Las Vegas for the Tyson fight. On its face, that detail seems small. But in investigations, small details are often the ones that either confirm a timeline or expose a contradiction. Flying would have been faster, simpler, and far more logical for a high-profile executive. So when the account emphasizes that Diddy wanted rental cars and a road drive, it creates the impression that the method of travel mattered, either for privacy, for control, or for reasons not explained publicly. Burroughs reportedly didn't just remember this, he logged it. Dates, costs, routes, specifics. And those handwritten notes have become significant because they are not he said, she said. They are physical records that can be tested against other evidence: rental records, credit card trails, tolls, hotel stays, and time windows. That's why the documentary suggests that investigators may be paying attention to them. If federal authorities are revisiting the bigger picture, journals like these become more than memories, they become anchors. They offer structure in a case that has spent decades floating in speculation. From there, the narrative shifts to the night the notorious B.I.G. was killed, and the shift is important because the pattern being implied is not just about one death, it's about two, and the idea that they may not be isolated tragedies. Gene Deal, Bad Boy's former head of security, describes what he believes was a catastrophic breakdown in protection. According to him, the security operation worked like a system of budgets, meaning security didn't only depend on perceived threat, it depended on whether the money to run protection had been officially approved for that time window. Gene describes a moment where one budget ended on Friday night after an awards-related event in Los Angeles, and the next budget, one that should have covered the transition and ensured Biggie's safety, was never opened. That detail matters because it frames what happened next not as unavoidable fate but as a preventable vulnerability. In his telling, there were warnings, there were known threats, there were enemies close by. And yet Biggie was out in Los Angeles without the level of security that had previously surrounded him. Gene's tone suggests that this wasn't merely unlucky. It was the kind of lapse that makes people wonder how a protection structure could fail so completely at the exact moment it was most needed. The implication is chilling. When you remove security in a city where tensions are already high, you don't just reduce protection, you create an opening. And in the story Gene tells, that opening was exploited. He describes the aftermath not only as tragedy but as the worst-case scenario for everyone involved, because once Biggie was gone, the entire organization was stranded in hostile territory, forced to think not only about grief but survival. This is why these claims continue to resurface. They don't rely on just one voice or one rumor. They form a chain: alleged conversations, alleged money, alleged intermediaries, alleged logistics, and then the repeated theme of security, movement, and proximity. Individually, each piece can be denied, but together they create a story that people keep returning to because it feels less like coincidence and more like design, at least to those who believe the allegations reflect what really happened. Shortly after midnight, the notorious B.I.G. left a crowded industry party in Los Angeles, moving through a city that was already tense with unresolved rivalries and whispered threats. As his vehicle came to stop at a red light, another car pulled up alongside him with deliberate timing. What followed happened in seconds. Gunfire erupted. There was no warning, no chance to react. Biggie was struck multiple times and rushed away from the scene, but it was already too late. He was pronounced dead not long after, just 24 years old. The shock rippled instantly through hip-hop, but beneath the grief, confusion quickly gave way to suspicion. The nature of the attack felt precise, controlled, and intentional, raising immediate doubts that this was a random act of street violence. In the days that followed, troubling patterns began to surface. Reports emerged suggesting that Biggie had been quietly planning to leave Bad Boy Records, a move that would have shifted power, money, and control in ways few people were prepared for. Almost immediately after his death, legal disputes over his publishing and estate followed, turning mourning into litigation. At the same time, public attention began drifting in a direction many observers found unsettling. Sean Diddy Combs appeared prominently on major magazine covers, released the tribute single I'll Be Missing You, and soon after launched his debut album, which went multi-platinum. Years later, Diddy would acknowledge that Biggie's death increased his own fame and visibility, an admission that, whether intended as honesty or reflection, reignited long-standing questions about who ultimately benefited most from the tragedy. As time passed, the story did not fade, it thickened. Allegations accumulated quietly, often surfacing briefly before disappearing again. People connected to Diddy were said to have fallen ill, withdrawn from public life, or died under circumstances some described as unusual. Lawsuits were filed, settlements were rumored, accusations were made, then walked back. None of these claims have been conclusively proven in court, and many remain disputed or legally unresolved. Still, they persist because of their consistency and because similar concerns have been raised independently by multiple people over the years. In unresolved cases, repetition itself becomes powerful. It keeps questions alive long after official investigations slow or stall. Against this backdrop, Gene Deal, Bad Boy's former head of security, believes the upcoming Keefe D trial could force a moment of reckoning. According to Gene, the defense strategy being used is unusually blunt. Keefe D is not denying involvement in the broader story. Instead, he is claiming that the chain of events leading to Tupac Shakur's murder traces back to Diddy. From a legal standpoint, however, the challenge is enormous. There is no physical evidence placing Keefe D at the scene pulling the trigger. What exists instead are alleged conversations, secondhand accounts, and circumstantial links built from interviews, informant statements, and overlapping timelines. That distinction matters. It is why the defense reportedly pushed for a bench trial rather than a jury trial, because a judge is expected to focus on verifiable proof rather than emotion, reputation, or public pressure. This reality makes the core questions impossible to avoid. Was money ever exchanged? If so, who authorized it and through whom did it move? Was it paid directly, funneled through intermediaries, or diverted along the way? Where did it originate and where did it ultimately land? Can any of this be supported by financial records, witness testimony, or sworn statements? Without a clear money trail, prosecutors face a steep uphill battle, especially given that Keefe D has told different versions of his story over the years. Each inconsistency invites skepticism, not only about specific details, but about the reliability of the entire narrative. The script also revisits a much older thread, reaching back to 1997. According to public discussion of the case, an informant allegedly told investigators that Diddy had hired members of the Southside Compton Crips to target both Suge Knight and Tupac Shakur. That informant reportedly claimed the same group involved in the MGM Grand altercation carried out the hit, and initially planned to act at Suge's laws. Vegas nightclub before deciding to strike immediately instead. What makes this especially notable is how closely this version aligns with what Keefe D would later claim years afterward. To some, that consistency suggests corroboration. To others, it raises the possibility of a story that solidified over time. Another lesser-known detail further complicates the official narrative. On the night Tupac was shot, Las Vegas police files reportedly document a second exchange of gunfire. As the white Cadillac fled the scene, a member of Death Row's entourage chased after it, and shots were exchanged between the two vehicles. Records indicate that the pursuing car was struck by a bullet, evidence of a second confrontation that rarely appears in mainstream retellings. This detail suggests chaos, pursuit, and retaliation in the immediate aftermath, adding depth to a night often summarized too cleanly. Taken together, these elements, who benefited, alleged financial motives, conflicting testimonies, overlooked evidence, and unresolved questions, are why the murders of Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G. continue to resist closure. Each new document, trial, or public statement doesn't simply reopen old wounds. It forces the uncomfortable possibility that the truth has not been hidden by lack of information, but by how difficult it is to prove intent when power, money, and silence intersect. According to Gene Deal, the case only truly comes together if someone is willing to step forward and say clearly, directly, and under oath that they personally witnessed something concrete, not rumors, not interpretations. But the conversation where intent was expressed, the exchange that confirmed an agreement, or the actual movement of money from one hand to another. Without that, the case remains suspended in the gray space between suspicion and proof, and even that kind of testimony is dangerous territory. When a witness has told multiple versions of the same story over time, every prior statement is dragged back into the open. Dates are compared, language is dissected, motives are questioned. Credibility becomes brittle. Prosecutors would be forced to explain not only why this version should be believed, but why it took decades for the truth to surface, and why earlier contradictions shouldn't outweigh the current claim. In a courtroom, time doesn't heal inconsistencies, it magnifies them. From there, the story pulls away from legal strategy and investigative theory and turns inward, toward the emotional and psychological state of Tupac Shakur in the final weeks of his life. His cousin describes a man living under relentless pressure, someone who could feel the walls closing in. There were moments of paranoia, flashes of anger, and an ever-present sense that something was off. Tupac wasn't just dealing with public feuds or industry politics. He was carrying the weight of contracts, street expectations, personal betrayal, and a growing realization that his freedom, both artistic and personal, was slipping away. In Las Vegas, after the fight at the MGM Grand, that tension boiled over. Tupac returned to the hotel vibrating with adrenaline, his energy sharp and erratic. He changed clothes, paced the room, searched for his crew, replayed the night in fragments. His voice was loud, his movements restless, yet beneath all of that intensity was something else: protectiveness. He repeatedly told the people closest to him to stay inside, to lock the door, to avoid the chaos unfolding outside. It wasn't paranoia for its own sake, it was instinct, a sense that the night wasn't finished with him yet. Looking back, his cousin believes Suge Knight may have been trying to warn her without ever saying the words out loud. She recalls being in an elevator with him, casually mentioning the fight, only for Suge to silence her with a finger to his lips. No explanation, no follow-up, just a clear signal to stop talking. At the time, it felt confusing, almost dismissive. In hindsight, it feels loaded. As if Suge understood that danger was closer than anyone wanted to admit, and that speaking openly could make things worse rather than better. She remembers Tupac that night as loud, charged, and overflowing with adrenaline, yet never reckless with the people he loved. Even in that heightened state, his concern wasn't for himself, it was for those around him. He insisted that his fiancée, Kidada Jones, and others stay safe and out of harm's way. Kidada, by all accounts, remained calm and grounded. She didn't escalate the moment or feed the chaos. Instead, she stayed composed, offering quiet support, acting as an anchor in a night that felt increasingly unstable. What Tupac's cousin confirms next challenges a long-standing narrative. Tupac wasn't living recklessly because he didn't care about the future. In fact, it was the opposite. He genuinely planned to marry Kidada. These weren't abstract dreams or emotional promises made in passing. He talked concretely out homes, about family, about business ventures, and about a life that extended far beyond death row records. He wanted out not just from the label, but from the constant tension, the politics, the feeling that his identity was being consumed by forces he no longer controlled. He was thinking long-term, even as the world around him seemed stuck in immediate conflict. One of the most haunting memories his cousin shares comes from a moment weeks earlier, inside a house that should have felt safe. Tupac was on the phone with someone connected to the death row camp, and the conversation escalated rapidly. What began as an argument turned into something explosive. He was screaming about his masters, about ownership, control, and being trapped. His veins bulged, sweat poured down his face, and his rage reached a level she had never seen before. This wasn't performance. This wasn't bravado. It was raw frustration spilling over, the sound of someone realizing how little power they truly had over their own work and future. What frightened her was Tupac himself. It was the consequences that kind of anger could unleash. She stood frozen, afraid to even walk past him, sensing that something irreversible was unfolding in real time. It felt as if the room itself had changed, as if a line had been crossed. In that moment, she says, it felt like death itself might come knocking, not as a metaphor, but as a presence. As if all the pressure, all the threats, all the unresolved conflict had finally aligned, pushing events toward an outcome no one in that room could stop. Former bad boy artist Freddie P offers a perspective rooted not in court documents or press narratives, but in what he calls street logic, the unwritten understanding that circulates quietly among people close to the environment where these events unfolded. According to him, many people in the streets never truly believed that Suge Knight was responsible for Tupac's death. He argues that if you were connected to the right circles, if you knew people who knew people, you heard a very different version of the story. It wasn't a version that fit neatly on paper or aligned with what mainstream narratives pushed, but it felt internally consistent to those who lived in that world. Freddie P compares it to the history of organized crime, where responsibility is often understood informally long before it can ever be proven in a courtroom. In those cases, everyone knows, but knowledge and proof are two very different things. He also insists that Suge Knight was deeply affected by Tupac Shakur's death in a way that went far beyond business or label politics. According to Freddie P, the bond between them was personal and emotional, closer to family than partners. He describes Suge not as someone who benefited from Tupac's death, but as someone who was genuinely broken by it. In his telling, Suge didn't just lose an artist, he lost someone he loved like a brother. That grief, Freddie P suggests, is one of the reasons the narrative blaming Suge never fully made sense to people who were paying attention on the inside. Freddie P also believes that many truths were hidden in plain sight all along, embedded in lyrics, slipped into ad-libs, and tucked into moments that people brushed off as bravado or artistic expression at the time. He suggests that if you listen closely, especially with hindsight, certain lines and phrases take on a different weight. In his view, money was always part of the equation, even if it was never openly discussed. He speculates that the reason certain individuals may not be behind bars today has less to do with innocence and more to do with deals that collapsed, intermediaries who betrayed one another, or money that never landed where it was supposed to. From his perspective, the streets were manipulated, pushed into fighting each other, while the real architects stayed insulated, protected by layers of distance, influence, and silence. Now, with the trial of Dwayne Keefe D. Davis approaching, public attention is sharper than it has been in decades. Old interviews are being replayed, forgotten statements are being re-examined, and long-dismissed details are being reconsidered with new urgency. Whether this case finally delivers definitive answers or simply exposes how deep the uncertainty really runs remains to be seen. But one thing is clear, the story of Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G. is far from finished. It continues to evolve not because people refuse to let go, but because too many questions have never been fully answered. Will you be watching the trial? Let us know in the comments.